Good morning, everybody, and welcome back for another Friday, another closing of the week with me this lunch break hour. So if you are new here, my name is Ivana, and we take you into stories for the day, interviews, take you out, tell you what's going on. And it's been a long week, or several weeks here in Birmingham, and a story that has been really talked about in the past week or so has involved the Alabama megachurch, Church of the Highlands. Now, that is Alabama's biggest church congregation-wise, and there's over 20 campuses across the state of Church of the Highlands. And there's been a lot of controversy surrounding that. And so we have our own religion reporter, Greg Garrison, here today to talk about the church, the recent controversy, and what's next. Just for a quick overview for everybody while you're getting logged on. Now, again, Church of the Highlands is the largest congregation-wise church in the state. And last month, the lead pastor, Chris Hodges, also founder of the church, came under fire for liking and following posts by Charlie Kirk on social media. And Charlie Kirk is the president of the conservative nonprofit Turning Point USA. And the pastor did issue an apology to his congregation on May the 31st. But in the past week, we have seen both the Housing Authority of the Birmingham District and the Birmingham Board of Education cancel their partnerships and leases with the church. So it's been a big week of talking about Church of the Highlands. So Greg, thank you so much for joining us, first of all. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what has happened this week and what all this controversy over Church of the Highlands is about?
Okay, well, like you said, the social media posts kind of flew under the radar for a while, but a high school English teacher from Carver High School saw these and pointed them out and did a social media post herself, showing some of the memes that Chris Hodges had liked that were put out by Turning Point USA. And she said she felt this was culturally insensitive, and this was in the wake of the George Floyd death at the hands of Minneapolis police. So it was a very sensitive time. There was a tinderbox there, and there was a lot of outrage over this. And one of the first things that happened then was the Birmingham Housing Authority said, we're not going to let you do any work in the housing authority communities anymore. And the type of work that Church of the Highlands did was sending in its huge teams of volunteers to do mentoring and so forth. Also, they banned Christ Health Center, which was founded by Church of the Highlands. It's a separate entity. They have separate boards, but they are related. The CEO of Christ Health Center attends and is on the staff at Church of the Highlands. And so they banned them too. And they were in the midst of doing free coronavirus testing at housing projects in Birmingham. So there's some cost there in cutting ties with the church and the clinic, and that a lot of people in the housing communities did rely on the church for services and relied on this health clinic for health care.
And there was no financial obligation or agreement between the housing authority and between the church.
No, it was simply the church asked permission to volunteer to go on the housing authority property, and that permission was granted several years ago. So it wasn't like Church of the Highlands was getting any federal money. I think that was a misunderstanding that happened right off the bat. A lot of people said, well, Church of the Highlands should have never been getting federal funds anyway. They weren't getting any federal funds for that.
It was volunteer-based.
They were offering volunteer services. And like I said, the coronavirus testing was being offered for free to those who had no health insurance. Now, the next thing that happened, that was on Monday. And then Tuesday, the Birmingham Board of Education voted to cut off its lease with Church of the Highlands. For years, Church of the Highlands had been renting Woodlawn High School auditorium and had a congregation there. And then 2 years ago, they started renting Parker High School in West Birmingham, just west of downtown. And Chris Hodges had placed a black pastor there to lead services on Sunday mornings. That was Mayo Sowell, a former Auburn football star. So they had a large congregation that was meeting at Parker High School on Sunday mornings before coronavirus. Keep in mind that the Church of the Highlands has not had in-person worship services since March the 10th. And is still not doing worship services. So they had not been meeting at Woodlawn or Parker, either one, for several months now. But the Board of Education said, we're terminating this lease. It was a costly decision for them because Church of the Highlands was paying $3,000 per site per week. So since they started renting from the Board of Education, these sites at the schools, it amounts to hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow.
Since 2014, it was over $800,000.
And that's money that had been going straight to the Birmingham Board of Education.
Yeah, it's basically, these auditoriums were not being used on Sundays, and the church came and said, we'd like to rent this auditorium and have a church service there. So they would have a team come in, set up, and then Sunday afternoon, they would break it down. So not that that's a huge part of the Birmingham City Schools budget. It's maybe 1% at tops, but still, for an inner city school system, losing $288,000 a year in income, it is significant. But there are a lot of people who said, we can't have this church where the pastor has been outspoken in his support of Donald Trump and this right-wing group, Turning Point USA. We can't have them coming into the city schools. It's especially right now when there's so much tension. They just felt it was good to cut ties.
Can you tell us a little bit about the posts that Pastor Chris had come under fire for liking on social media from Charlie Kirk? Can you tell us about, you mentioned some memes that have been going around.
If people go to Charlie Kirk 1776 on Instagram, you can see all these posts. One of the ones that he liked is a meme that probably has been seen by almost everybody who's watching. There was a picture of Donald Trump from the 70s. He was pictured with Muhammad Ali and Rosa Parks. And then there was another picture of Governor Northam of Virginia from his old medical school yearbook photo, which he admitted he was in. It had featured a student with blackface and another one with a Klan uniform. And it compared and contrast and basically made the argument of, everybody says Donald Trump's a racist, but here he is with Muhammad Ali and Rosa Parks. And then here's this Democratic governor of Virginia. He's, in this infamous photo, which was clearly racist. So it just struck people as culturally insensitive for a pastor of a megachurch that has a large Black population to make that kind of social media statement. Now, he was liking a post and there were over 40,000 likes on the post. So it kind of flew under the radar. Nobody really noticed. But if you go looking through the likes on social media, you can find everybody who liked a post. And his name was there. And I think it's since been deleted and he's since apologized. But a lot of people found that culturally insensitive. And really, Church of the Highlands, since Chris Hodges started it in 2001, renting Mountain Brook High School in the auditorium there, even though it started in a very affluent suburb of Birmingham, he's always tried to be racially inclusive, always sent volunteer teams out to help in the Black community. So he's prided himself on a sense of racial inclusiveness that made Black worshipers feel welcome at the church. And so they had thousands of members worshiping who were Black, a lot of minority participation. Mm-hmm. If you go and watch the videos on Sundays of the praise team, it's racially integrated. It's more of a Pentecostal style, upbeat praise service, and it is very welcoming and enticing to minority audiences too. So
I want to ask you about that in a second, but first let's get to, I know Pastor Chris issued an apology to the church on May the 31st. Can you tell us what he said in that apology?
Yeah, he was at first a little bit vague. He mentioned it in a prayer meeting on that Saturday and then in the Sunday morning service. And then he came back with a more specific statement on Monday or Tuesday in which he specifically said, I don't mean what it looks like I meant, or I don't believe everything that's implied in those posts. So he basically backed down. He was very tearful and emotional in his Sunday morning service apology. A lot of people still thought he didn't get it, why it was offensive. And, I think a lot of people probably still think that.
Did he give any reason as to why he liked the post? I know we've seen in the past different celebrities or public people will say that they just were scrolling and happened to just click things as they scroll and like them. Did the pastor give any sort of reason for why he liked those posts if he said he didn't agree with the messaging?
No, he didn't, but I believe he has a friendship with Charlie Kirk, and Charlie Kirk came out and defended him. Donald Trump Jr. came out and defended him. Jeff Sessions, who's running for his old U.S. Senate seat, came out and defended him. So in a way, it's kind of an election year controversy. Chris Hodges is very clearly a Republican. He's been associated with an evangelical group that supports Trump. I talked to the historian Wayne Flint for the story that I just posted today on AL.com that kind of looks at the church history, Church of the Highlands history. And, it should be no surprise to anybody that Chris Hodges was a Republican. Most megachurch white evangelical pastors in Alabama are Republicans and do have a lot of those views and probably do sympathize with Turning Point Foundation, although maybe it wouldn't be the smartest thing to be really obvious and public about that on social media by liking posts or commenting on posts. So there was maybe a lack of savvy on his part in handling the social media.
Something that you mentioned earlier was that the diverse group of people who attend the Church of the Highlands services. Now, we know that Church of the Highlands, again, is the biggest church in Alabama. There's over 20 campuses across the state, or 20 places where the services are held. Now, most of those services are televised from Pastor Chris and his sermon as well, except for one in the western part of Birmingham, which was put on by Pastor Mayo Sewell, former Auburn football player. And Mayo Sewell actually delivered his own sermons. Once again, there hadn't been services out there for several months. So the service that everybody would be watching on video is Pastor Chris Hodges preaching on most Sundays. But Mayo Sewell's sermons were instead of Pastor Chris's sermon at that location at Parker High School. That would be the exception statewide. Every other branch from Mobile to Huntsville, Auburn to Tuscaloosa, you're getting beamed in the Chris Hodges sermon on Sunday morning, or if there's a substitute preacher, there would be music locally by a local praise band at the branch campuses. So the Parker High School service had a bit of autonomy in appealing to the Black community in Birmingham, and so Mayo Sewell was allowed to do his own sermons. So the cancellation of that contract for that Parker High School building. Now, again, that was a contract that Church of the Highlands had with the Birmingham Board of Education, which the Birmingham Board of Education terminated on Tuesday. And that contract allowed Church of the Highlands to basically rent out on Sundays the Woodlawn High School Auditorium and the Parker High School Auditorium. Parker High School is the one we've been talking about with Pastor Mayo. Now, what is the plan now, since the Parker High School campus was the only one in the Church of the Highlands family that where Pastor Mayo is allowed to hold his own sermons instead of televising Pastor Chris's sermons? What does the future look like for Pastor Mayo and that branch of the Church of the Highlands family?
Right now, the coronavirus restrictions are still in effect. They are not meeting in person. They are tentatively looking at June 21st as a start back time. So they have a couple weeks to figure that out. I would note that the Woodlawn High School service, before they started at Woodlawn High School, it grew out of a building that the Church of the Highlands owned. They bought an abandoned firehouse in Woodlawn and fixed it up and called it the Dream Center. And that's been kind of the hub of all their inner city volunteer work in Birmingham. So the Dream Center has a chapel in it, but it was really too small after a little while. So that's why they started renting the Woodlawn High School auditorium in 2012. They needed bigger meeting space. What will happen in Woodlawn possibly is the church could find another large building. There are buildings available out there. They've looked at property in that area. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Church of the Highlands would buy another building in Woodlawn. As far as Parker High School, it wouldn't shock me if they rented a space and moved that congregation. The church does rent out the Lyric Theater quite often for its youth group meetings. I'm sure they could rent out a lot of places for what they were paying to rent out Parker High School, which was $3,000 a week.
Right.
So I think they'll come up with the solution on that. The Church of the Highlands has a lot of means, and they could certainly find a place to meet if they choose to do so. Or they could say, hey, everybody who is meeting at these, we're not going to be meeting in this area anymore. You can come to the main campus on Grants Mill Road.
Mm-hmm. Now, who else have we seen of public interest that has voiced their support or condemned publicly Pastor Chris? I know that former Attorney General, U.S. Attorney General, and current Alabama Senate candidate Jeff Sessions has voiced his approval or his support rather of Pastor Chris. And I know that Donald Trump Jr. has also talked about Pastor Chris and about the situation as well. So who else has been voicing their opinions publicly about the church and Pastor Chris's situation right now?
Well, this is a very heated election year with Donald Trump up for re-election, Jeff Sessions trying to win the Republican nomination against Tommy Tuberville and face Doug Jones in November. So I think it falls pretty neatly along Democratic-Republican Party lines. The Republicans would support Chris Hodges on this, and the Democrats would condemn him on this. So it fits pretty neatly into a very hotly contested election year.
I think this is an interesting question from Cherry. She said, so Pastor Chris cannot have it both ways. Either he doesn't believe the post that he liked and he's apologized for that, or he is not really sorry and he really does agree with Charlie Kirk. Now, to Cherry's point, has Pastor Chris made any sort of comments, or has he made any sort of statements about his friendship and his ongoing relationship with Charlie Kirk? Does he plan to continue that, or has he made any comments about that?
No, Charlie Kirk has mentioned that they have a friendship and that he was expecting to speak to a church youth group. They have motion conferences and things like that where they bring in outside speakers. Charlie Kirk said that he was planning to speak at one of those. Obviously, that got canceled. My feeling is that Chris Hodges is doing some soul searching right now about how he really feels. But, honestly, I don't see him changing his stripes too much. I mean, he was a pro-Trump Republican who did a lot of inner city ministry. And I think that's kind of who he is at heart. He can distance himself and regret the social media likes. But at the base, I think that's probably who he is.
Question for, and this brings up this is not a question, but this brings up a question to me. Laura says, I've been a member for over 10 years and I'm walking away. Have you had, and Greg, you've been covering religion for a long time for us. And have you heard from a lot of people like Laura who have said that they've been a member of Church of the Highlands for a long time, and this is the cutoff point for them? This is the end for them?
Sure, I'm sure there's going to be some of that. I have heard from some people. I wonder at what level of commitment they are. I think the most committed people who are members and tithing and electronically are probably not going anywhere. The people who have been watching on TV for the last 3 months may stop watching on TV. I don't really think it's going to hurt Church of the Highlands that much. Remember, they haven't even had an in-person service since March the 10th.
And going off of that, our colleague Brent asked, could this potentially have the opposite effect of what some people think and actually be a boom for the church?
Well, I think the key demographic is going to see how the Black membership of Church of the Highlands responds. I mean, a lot of people will be looking to people like leaders like Mayo Soul and, what he has to say about this. I mean, his job is being the campus pastor for Parker High School. So what happens to him? And I have attended a service at Parker High School, and they had 800 plus people there easily, and it was an all Black audience. So what happens to those supporters of Church of the Highlands who, experience discomfort with maybe realizing Pastor Chris's political stance isn't what they thought it was, perhaps? That'll be what tells.
Right. Laura's replying saying that she was committed. She's been tithing for 10 years. Laura, I'm not going to put words in Greg's mouth, but I don't think that he was implying that you personally were not committed to the church. I think he was just saying that people in senior leadership roles are probably not as surprised as some people who are attending the church and not in those roles. So again, I'm not putting words in Greg's mouth, but I don't believe that's what he meant.
And, as I mentioned before, I talked to Wayne Flint, who's the state's foremost historian of religion, and he doesn't think it will have a negative effect long-term on Church of the Highlands and their growth. This is a church that's exponentially grown from a few hundred people in 2001 meeting in a rented facility in Mountain Brook to more than 21 locations, including one in Columbus, Georgia, with more than 50,000 people meeting in person the last time they met in person, the early March. So their growth is unprecedented. They started a college recently, Highlands College, a few years ago, and they just recently bought a campus for it out on US 280. So this still is a church that's experiencing incredible growth that a lot of churches envy.
I think that this is interesting. Becky says what this church has done and I think that this is a lot of, I'm going to put this on the screen. I think this is what a lot of people feel. She says what this church has done in and for the community speaks volumes about the character of the pastor and of the church, not somebody's interpretation of a couple of tweets or posts. And this is, I think, something that we have heard a lot of. And I'm going to take this down in a second just so we're not blocking your face here, Greg. But I think that that's something that we've heard a lot of people say and a lot of supporters of the church say. So what have you heard about that from officials in the religion sector here in Alabama?
Well, I have a quote in the story that I just put up this morning from Lane Schrantz, who's the associate pastor who helped start the church with Chris in 2001. He moved here to Birmingham at the same time Chris did to help him get it off the ground. And he said, Pastor Chris doesn't have a racist bone in his body. His 20 years of ministry here proves that. And I think that that's where Pastor Chris would stand, is on his record of, I personally have been covering Church of the Highlands since before it started. And I haven't seen a white evangelical pastor that's done as much inner city work, outreach, being successful in integrating worship services as Chris Hodges. So his record does say a lot for him.
William asked,
stand on that.
Correct. William asked about what the pastor did. And if you're late to the game, William, and if anybody's late to the game and wants to know what we're talking about, those posts and everything, we do have links in the comments. I'm pointing up because it's up on my screen, but it's down for y'all. We do have links in the comments on some of our latest coverage here that were by Greg Garrison and some other of our colleagues about the posts about Chris Hodges and the controversy that has been happening surrounding Church of the Highlands in the past few weeks. Looking at another couple of comments here, and then I'm going to let you go, Greg. But while I'm looking through these comments, tell us, has Pastor Mayo said anything? We've talked about him and about his role in that Parker High School campus, and about how he's the only pastor aside from Pastor Chris who is able to preach his own sermons at the Sunday services. So has he made any sort of comments about the posts by Charlie Kirk?
No, he hasn't publicly commented. If he's listening, I'd like for him to call me, and if he wants to talk, I'd sure like to hear what he has to say. There are a lot of Auburn and Alabama football players who attended the campus branches of Church of the Highlands. I'd like to hear what they say. I think a lot of people maybe are disillusioned to find out about Pastor Chris's social media activity. But, I don't know how shocked you could be that a white evangelical megachurch pastor is pro-Trump and pro-Turning Point USA. I just think it was very poor judgment on his part to be liking memes and things like that on social media. It seems a little bit beneath him for somebody who needs to be aware of the image he projects in the community, because he does reach out to the inner city community. He's as active in providing ministry in Birmingham housing projects as anybody I've ever seen. So yeah, I think it did prove to be culturally insensitive.
Looking through again some of these comments quickly. Marcus, I'm sorry that you think that I showed a comment that was one side of the story and not the other. I'm trying to pull them. The comments are just coming in quickly, so it's hard for me to grab. Something that I think we should quickly talk about before we let everybody go is that Cindy makes a question about who is this English teacher. Now, I think what she's talking about is the teacher who kind of put out there that Pastor Chris had been liking those posts from Charlie Kirk. So can you provide any insight on this teacher who personally called out the pastor? Does he or she rather attend Church of the Highlands, or do you have any of that information?
No, she never attended Church of the Highlands. She's an English teacher at Carver High School. And she simply did some research on Turning Point USA and noticed Chris Hodges liking posts. I talked to her again yesterday, and she asked me to stop calling her by name. I interviewed her for the first story, so you can still find that on the May 31st story, I think, her name and what she had to say. She basically called him out for being culturally insensitive. And, you know, at the time, it's a racial powder keg because of the George Floyd killing. It was right after that. So, you know, I'm not going to name her name on here, but you can find it in my original story about this controversy. She did not attend Church of the Highlands, and she said she had nothing personally against Chris Hodges. She was just pointing out what she thought was something that was culturally insensitive. And of course, it just blew up. That post was shared thousands of times.
Right. Well, something that I'm going to end on is a comment here from Charity, and she says that she believes this conversation is why. This is her words. I believe that this is why so many of us are hurt by his actions, meaning Pastor Chris, saying that she had chose the church for its diversity and for the way that Pastor Chris had spoken out against racism in the past. So I think that's a good comment to end on, Charity. We appreciate it. And we appreciate all of you for watching, for commenting, for interacting with us. I'm sorry if we if we didn't get to your question, please let us know. I will link Greg's latest story on Church of the Highlands from this morning in this comment thread. You can find all the previous posts as well at the top of this comment thread. And that way you can learn a little bit more about what we're talking about here. So thank all of you so much for tuning in and interacting with us. Thank you, Greg, so much. And we hope that everybody has a safe weekend, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, Yvonne.